This month, our theme is living with intention. There's so much to explore with that topic, beginning with the thought that there's a whole ethical school of thought that centers around our intentions. For Immanuel Kant, who was an influence on Felix Adler, who was the founder of the First Society for Ethical Culture, intention is paramount in ethics. Because we can't know what the results of our actions will be, it is crucial to have the right intention behind our acts. Kant would judge the ethics of an act by the intention behind it. There is another school of ethics, the utilitarian school, and that argues that what really matters is not intent but impact. How does your action actually affect others? Good intentions can be behind acts which produce harm, however unintended. Others, often, that harm is often unnoticed. And what the actor meant by good intention may not have even taken into account the effects on others that those others are seeing or experiencing as harm. Now, sometimes we see in life that there's a choice between our own peace and comfort and some risks we might take to make change to benefit those who do not now have peace and comfort. Either intention to take the risk or settle in our peace and comfort may cause discomfort or even harm. Both are good intentions, meaning the intention is to do something good for at least one person. The 20th century theologian Reinhold Niebuhr, who was an influence on Martin Luther King, put it this way: no virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. Niebuhr himself changed and evolved both his political positions and his theological positions, often because he saw the impact of the ideas that he was following. Now, I don't agree with all of his theology or some of his politics, but on this we agree. No virtuous act is quite as virtuous from the standpoint of our friend or foe as it is from our standpoint. So consider this choice, just looking at the intent for good outcomes for ourselves. Perhaps we have an annoying physical condition that can be cured by a certain medical treatment. 95% of the time, that treatment will cure our condition, and 5% of the time, it will make it worse. Our intention, no matter which choice we make to take the treatment or not, is a good intention, and either good intention might have a harmful impact. So I'm going to take seriously the quote that is embedded in our statement of purpose: we are human, not perfect. We cannot know all the consequences of our acts. And if we didn't act without knowing and approving of every possible consequence, we would probably never act, which itself might have harmful effect. Or, as the neuroscientists have found, we do have a natural altruism in us, and we seek to act in ways that benefit ourselves and others. We also often believe we are acting altruistically when we are actually working more for our own goals. We often deceive others and ourselves about our intentions. Have you ever done something with positive intention that turned out to your regret to do harm? Or has someone close to you in a relationship had a positive intention, yet their action caused you harm? Or think about major social issues. Is there an area where you are aware that out of good intentions, you are creating a negative impact? So for those of you who are here today on Zoom, I'm going to invite you to join a breakout room in a minute to share a bit about those questions, which I'll repeat in a minute. For those watching the recording later, I invite you to pause the recording and take some moments to ponder, maybe even write some notes on how you would answer. So I'm going to repeat the questions first for you to explore, and if you're in a breakout room, You get a chance to listen for understanding to your conversation partner or partners. If you find yourself momentarily in a breakout room without anyone else, just hold on a minute and we'll switch people around. If you're having any problems in the room, you can leave the room. Remember not to leave the meeting, just the room, and come back for assistance. So the questions again. Have you ever done something with positive intention that turned out to your regret to do harm? Or has someone close to you in a relationship had a positive intention, yet their action caused you harm? Or in major social issues, is there an area that you are aware of where with the best of intentions you have created a harmful impact? So I'll see you in 5 minutes as you share with someone else your answers to that. So I asked you to explore your own experiences, and I hope you identified sometimes when your own intentions were either mistaken or even self-deceptive. Because if we can't recognize that in ourselves, it will be more difficult to recognize it in others. I'm going to give you my own example. Before 2006, not a single state in the United States required a voter to produce a government ID as a condition for voting. When I lived in Virginia, their new voter ID law in 2008 increased my voting time. At 2 p.m., the time of day when I used to just walk in and vote and walk out. That added a wait of about 15 minutes. Then a tighter voter ID law in 2012 resulted in, at the same time of day, a 2-hour wait to vote. What was the intention behind these laws? According to the supporters of the laws in their public statements, it was to counter voter fraud. Even though no voter fraud has been detected in sufficient numbers to affect elections. Occasionally, a legislator would say something in public that it was actually to give a certain political party more of an advantage by targeting poor voters or voters of a certain identity for whom it would be harder to vote under the new laws. And it is true that the more rapidly a state's population was diversifying, the more likely that legislators would implement voter ID laws. Some of these laws have been overturned in court because of the disproportionately harmful effects on some groups of voters. Well, that's the background. Here's my story. A person I knew in the mid-2000s, generally in agreement with the politics that I had, suddenly became an ardent proponent of the voter ID laws. She believed that these laws would make our elections more democratic by eliminating fraud. Even though some legislators made clear that their real reason wasn't fraud, she believed that that was the reason. And to be frank, having lived in the city of Chicago for years and been a poll watcher there, I get why people are afraid of election fraud. In one election I was a poll watcher for, I myself caught out one vote-stealing scheme that was on behalf of the regular Democratic Party when a progressive candidate looked like he might win the primary. Now, that fraud was not about voter ID. It was chain balloting, where both votes were being bought. So my friend, in this case, went all in on support for voter ID laws. Her intentions were good, to reduce voter fraud and have democratic elections. Well, I happen to think that she was misinformed, and I also happen to think that the inability of those without government-issued IDs creates more harmful impact by preventing some legitimate voters from voting. That can happen for a variety of reasons, especially if you are poor, and even more so after the 9/11 2001 new rules making getting an ID very difficult. I also don't understand, with little evidence that voter fraud affects election outcomes, how we could justify the huge costs of all the new laws, both directly and in voter time. But it would do no good in conversations with this friend to accuse her of intentionally causing harm. In order to understand her reasons, I had to assume she started from good intentions. If I accused her of bad intention, our conversation would frankly be over. She did eventually change her mind. How? One, I took seriously within the conversation her intention. And I asked her to find me some of that evidence of how voter fraud had changed election outcomes. Looking for what she couldn't find began to make her more open to the idea that the harm she wanted to prevent was all that harmful. As long as she was seeing the outcome as harmful without evidence, she saw a need for action. And then a presidential election came around, and it took her 2 hours to vote. Well, that did it. As long as she didn't see the harm caused by the action she supported, she didn't see the harm. We tend to judge impact on how it impacts us when we are deciding what actions to take and what to do. Now, you might be all judgy about her position, but think about climate change. I would guess that there is not a single person in attendance who has made every single change in our lives that would best counter climate change, including being active politically to advocate where there is an opportunity to do so. We had recently several opportunities to simply write a letter or make a phone call, where one voice would add to the numbers and perhaps, if enough made that choice, have an impact. How many wrote that letter or made that phone call? You can still make the phone call. Save your chat before you leave to save the link, which Billy will put in chat. Now, I'm sure in your reflection time, you explored some personal experiences. I think of someone I was once in a work relationship with. This guy was a very kind person. He was especially kind to whoever was the last person he interacted with, and he went out of the way to help. As a result, he often missed appointments and commitments if someone else's problem had captured his attention. And that caused at least inconvenience to others, and it occasionally caused projects to fail because we missed deadlines as a team because there was someone who needed him there right then. Unintended consequences of good intentions. Different priorities than what others had. And making that choice that served him and that one other person ignored the needs of others that he'd made commitments to earlier. And to be honest, haven't we all done this in some way sometime? Doing good in the moment, ignoring another good that might have affected more people? So this is my point. When we are in a relationship, whether we're just trying to connect or we're trying to influence that other person, assuming good intentions is essential as a starting point. That is also not to say that impact doesn't matter. If you've listened to me much before, you know that I highly value impact, and my ethics often judge more by impact than intention. But even when impact is harmful, it does not help for us to ascribe bad intentions where there likely weren't any. If we are interested in educating the person about the impact, they are not likely to listen if we begin with an accusation of bad intention. Now, if I had accused my voter fraud believing friend of racism and ableism, she would not have engaged in conversation which might shift her sense of what matters in making such choices. If I had accused my coworker of not caring about his team, I'd be unlikely to help him break his habit of ignoring anyone but the latest person who called on his help. That is not to say that there aren't those whose intentions are either directly to do harm to some others or whose intentions are made without care about who they may harm. There are some people whose intention is to give themselves pleasure by seeing the suffering of others, sad to say. Some people enjoy cruelty. Yeah, maybe that's a kind of a good intention too. What they see as good for them might give us important insight, though, into how to react, even in that case. So if someone's good intention includes doing harm to others, or doesn't include us or vulnerable others, and they're not open to changing, then we know to set a boundary on their actions. The word no is a valid communication to someone whose good intentions don't take into account harm to you or those who matter to you. Action to stop harm to yourself or vulnerable others is also ethically responsible. I'd say actually ethically required in such situations. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, my mother used to say. And by that she meant two things, as did, I believe, the original person who invented that quote. First, that having an intention to do something and not acting on it does create an impact. First, by not doing that something, and second, by undermining trust in your word. And yes, we all sometimes fail to live up to our intentions. We are human, not perfect. But only intention and never action is likely to create harmful impact. And the second thing that quote means, every harmful action is done with some good intention in the mind of the doer. What if those in one political party believe that the world is much better with them in charge, and so they create voter suppression laws that make it more likely they'll be in charge? What if some believe that African American votes aren't really American votes, and we want to make America great again by not having so many African American votes? From that person's perspective, that's a good intention. They want a certain kind of outcome that serves their purposes, and they have an action plan to get there. So if we want to oppose that action and its impact, we have to take seriously their intention, especially when we disagree that such an outcome is good. We act in knowledge of what they believe is good, and we counter with a different version of what is good. Show the inadequacy of that vision to those who are making choices between that vision and a different vision, one in which African Americans are Americans, and so are poor people, disabled people, trans people, Latinx people, who are also disadvantaged by voter suppression laws. Another example, I was recently reading about the issue of human trafficking in Singapore. The title of the book was Paved with Good Intentions, Human Trafficking and the Anti-Trafficking Movement in Singapore. The anti-trafficking movement has largely been funded by big donors from abroad and has included some rescue operations planned and staged from those with good intentions to rescue young girls from the sex industry primarily. The authors of the book, though, point out that these are the most severe and unambiguous cases, but they are not the only trafficking cases, or even most of them. Trafficking in Singapore also includes using force or fraud or deception to gain the consent of another in order to control them, including not just sexual exploitation, but also forced labor and services, slavery, and similar practices. And there is plenty of evidence of other types of trafficking there than in the sex industry. Involuntary servitude as domestic servants for both women and men, particularly refugees, is a major problem. Adult women, and not just young girls, are trafficked for work in the sex industry, in bars and in clubs. Men are forced to work in a variety of often risky jobs. Financial exploitation, leveraging debts against the person, and failure of the government to take seriously complaints of refugees are major factors there in trafficking. Also ignored, that even if someone is being exploited in the sex industry, some people voluntarily are in that industry, and it is the circumstances of their work, not that they are sex workers, that is the problem in trafficking. Also ignored, efforts on the part of those being exploited to change their own circumstances as they advocate for policy changes. Yet this argument goes, young girls being kidnapped for the sex industry is the major narrative and attracts most attention and most money to ending that variety of exploitation. And outsiders in this narrative have the responsibility to rescue and rehabilitate the victims, rather than enabling those who are oppressed to organize for themselves. And so the argument continues, those other victims are largely ignored, And major causes behind trafficking, that is, financial and refugee status, are not addressed at all, nor is a major solution possibility, that is, supporting self organizing efforts. And so the problem continues because root causes are not addressed and some solutions are missed. And those being trafficked are not being consulted about what solutions are needed, paved with good intentions. Another book I found, the title is called The Hell of Good Intentions. It's about American foreign policy. I am guessing each of us has our ideas about what good intentions in our foreign policy have proven to be harmful, especially when we make decisions for other countries without their participation. In relationships and personal differences about what is good and harmful, it's sometimes a little harder to see this than it is in seeing it in the larger world. Well, I read this story online recently. A man wanted to buy jewelry for his girlfriend, so he asked his best friend for advice. The best friend asked him, "Is most of her jewelry silver or is it gold?" "She only wears silver." "Well, then buy her something gold so your gift will stand out as something special." And he followed that advice. Then he wondered why she was cool to receiving the gift and rarely wore it. I hope you see the issue. He had good intentions, but he didn't thoroughly empathize or even come out and ask her, "Why is all your jewelry silver?" If we look at the girlfriend's perspective, given that there's no evidence in the story that they talked about this, what is she thinking? So many possibilities. One is that she assumes his intention was to try to change her tastes to fit his. Another is that he just didn't care enough to notice what she wears. And she apparently never shared with him why her jewelry was silver, or why she wasn't wearing his gift, or why the gift was a disappointment. Was her good intention to protect his feelings, which her not wearing the gift was not doing? Did she assume he wasn't really paying attention, and thus the relationship wasn't as deep as she wanted it to be? All around, if everyone had assumed good intention, they could have had a civil conversation, and maybe they would have ended up laughing at the gift of the Magi aspect of the story, each trying to please the other and both failing. And let's acknowledge that when we're hurting from an impact, it's sometimes difficult to ascribe those good intentions. The intersection of political and personal is yet another area to apply this. Let's take a very simple example. You have a young daughter that you bring to the Ethical Society, and another parent or an older member says to her, "You're so pretty." But you want to raise your daughter to know she is valued for much more than her looks. You might say to that other adult, "Oh, you're so sexist." Or you could assume that they had good intentions, take the person aside, and quietly thank them for their interest in your daughter and their wanting to connect to and praise her, assuming that was their good intention. And then tell them that you've learned that there are alternative things to say to young girls to help the girls understand that they're valued for more than their good looks. That's what happens when you assume good intentions. Now, in every one of these cases, there's an unspoken second assumption. Assume ignorance. In this case, it's obvious. We've all experienced girls being complimented for their looks so often that we are accustomed to that being the right way to give a compliment to a girl. We don't tend to tell boys, "You're so pretty." And most of us, I hope, don't think girls are valuable for their looks. So when we do that, it is ignorance. It is ignorance that so many buy into a narrative of trafficking that is promoted widely through film and through advocacy work, and that is too narrow to really solve the problems. And most of us, if we reflect on it, also care about those other forms of exploitation too, and really do want to trust that those being exploited are treated as fully human and have some agency of their own that needs support, not just rescue. Again, yes, there are those who are willfully ignorant or not caring about some people. Obviously, those who are traffickers care more about their own wealth and comfort than about the harm they are doing to people. And let's be real. Aren't some of us aware of the role of trafficking and child and adult exploitation in the chocolate industry? Yet, sometimes we don't want to pay more for our chocolate, so we support companies that exploit. We are all willfully ignorant sometimes. But if we are to have a relationship with someone, assuming good intentions is a key starting point. But also key, full participation or mutuality. Having good intentions without consulting the person we have intentions for is often going to go wrong. Related to that is transparency and actively seeking out inclusion and information. Also key, setting boundaries when others' good intentions are harmful to you, when their intentions don't include others, ourselves or those who are more vulnerable, or their good intentions are ignorant, whether innocently or willfully. One way we set boundaries regarding social issues is by passing laws. We could tax more heavily those whose economic decisions are harming others. We can outlaw or heavily tax certain products that harm the environment. We can reward actions with more positive impacts. Voting itself is a way of setting boundaries, of saying no to more harm and yes to less harm. No wonder voting is contentious. Who wins the vote is about who gets to set those boundaries. Is that better entrusted to the few with power or to the many? Assuming good intentions is, I believe, the beginning, although not the end, of ethical communication. So I invite you this week, when you're angry or scared about something someone else is saying or doing, consider this. What is their good intention? And how can I work with that? It might be considering that I might be mistaken and can learn from them. Or it might be that I use that information as an opportunity to educate or even to set boundaries. Most of all, assuming good intentions can be contagious. And in our moments of ignorance or forgetting to be inclusive in our caring, when others react as if we have good intentions, even when we are mistaken, we too can bring our actions more in line with our deepest values. And we'll say goodbye to those who are watching on video and invite you to find out more about us at www.rysec.org.